Blood was already congealing when first responders arrived. A dark, thick pool had spread from the victim's upper chest, streaking the white tile floor and seeping into the grooves between grout. It hadn't splattered. It had poured. Not from a struggle, but from a single, fatal strike. 55-year-old Andre Brown lay motionless in the front doorway of his home, eyes fixed, mouth slightly open, hands relaxed by his sides. There were no signs of forced entry. No shattered furniture. No upturned chairs. Only the quiet presence of death and the steady, artificial hiss of a burner left running in the kitchen. Brown's body position told investigators everything about the moment of impact. He hadn't braced, hadn't recoiled, hadn't even raised an arm. The wound, a deep stab to the upper right chest, had severed the aorta and collapsed a lung, causing him to bleed out internally within minutes. There were no defense injuries, no scratches, no signs of grappling. This wasn't the result of an escalating fight. It was a deliberate act, delivered at close range, with precision and intent. Initial responders noted the pristine condition of the interior. The table had been set for a meal. There was no broken glass, no shouting heard by neighbors, and no indication of anyone entering or exiting in haste. The front door was unlocked. Inside, Helen Fraser, Brown's live-in girlfriend of several months, was waiting. She had been the one to call 911. According to her, Brown had opened the door to greet an old friend. Moments later, he collapsed. Her explanation seemed plausible at first. Fraser claimed the visitor was a man named Milton Leak, someone from Brown's past, a fellow veteran who had once shared a shelter with him. She described him clearly, right down to his jacket and shoes. She said the two men argued briefly over an unpaid debt, then stepped outside. When they returned, things seemed calm. Then, the sound of a door slamming. When she looked again, Brown was down. She performed CPR until paramedics arrived. What she didn't know, or didn't expect, was that crime scene investigators would find no evidence of a second person. No footprints on the freshly mopped floor. No fingerprints other than the couple's. No foreign DNA. There were no security cameras inside the home, but the neighborhood was lined with residential systems. None of them captured anyone resembling Leak. More importantly, there was no trace of him ever being there that day. For a homicide without forced entry, the field of suspects narrows quickly. The perpetrator must have been known to the victim, trusted enough to be let inside. In this case, there was no need for trust. The suspect lived there. That shifted the investigation immediately. Analysts began evaluating Fraser's account not as a witness statement, but as a potential deception. The emotional flatness of her voice during the emergency call, the lack of urgency. The delay in calling 911. Over 11 minutes from the moment she claimed to have found the body. Fraser had no prior criminal history, no documented behavioral disturbances. But behavioral analysis doesn't rely on background. It relies on patterns. Her statements began to change under repeated questioning. The man at the door was described differently in each version. The timing of the argument shifted. In some retellings, she heard shouting. In others, she didn't. At one point, she claimed a second unknown man had come into the house earlier, but she couldn't name or describe him. Her inconsistencies weren't due to confusion. They formed a calculated strategy, keeping the narrative just vague enough to avoid contradiction, but just detailed enough to mislead. She introduced new suspects only after being pressed. This behavior mirrors what is commonly seen in cases involving manipulative perpetrators who exert control through narrative, offering fragments of truth alongside fabricated elements, maintaining the illusion of cooperation while concealing key facts. The absence of any physical evidence pointing to a break-in, combined with the anatomical precision of the fatal wound, ruled out a spontaneous attack by an outsider. The nature of the injury suggested the use of a kitchen knife, and investigators recovered several from a drying rack beside the sink. Only one was missing. No forced entry, no theft, no chaos, just a man bleeding out in his own home in silence. Brown had recently reconnected with family. He was planning to visit his son that afternoon. Friends described him as generous, protective, and slow to anger, not the type to provoke violence, especially from someone he considered close. Yet, nothing had been stolen. No money was missing. No valuables disturbed. The only thing taken was his life. Fraser's behavior after the killing mirrored patterns observed in similar domestic homicides, not of rage, but of reasserting control. She cleaned. She delayed. She manipulated her account. Most notably, she immediately redirected suspicion toward a third party. This tendency to deflect responsibility, paired with her narrative inconsistencies and the forensically silent crime scene, raised a critical question. If there was no intruder and no evidence of a struggle, then who placed the knife in Andre Brown's chest? The name came quickly. When questioned by detectives just hours after the murder, Helen Fraser identified the killer without hesitation: Milton Leak. According to her, he was an old friend of Andre Brown's, someone who had lived in shelters with him during more difficult times. She claimed he had stopped by to wish them a happy new year, and when a conversation about an old debt escalated, things turned deadly. She described his outfit, his voice, even the tone of the brief argument. Her confidence left little room for doubt. Yet the physical evidence told a different story. Leak was located the next day at a nearby shelter. His demeanor during questioning was agitated, but not combative. He denied any involvement, stated he had not seen Brown in weeks, and claimed he had spent the previous night at a motel, which police later confirmed through payment records. His clothing, the same he wore during the interview, matched the vague description Helen had given, but no blood, fibers, or trace evidence connected him to the crime scene. The contradictions began to surface quickly. Helen had said she saw Leak face to face, yet later admitted she only heard his voice. Then she modified that statement again, suggesting she only recognized his coat, a coat she alleged had once belonged to her. She never saw the weapon. She never saw the attack. She simply claimed to have found Brown on the floor, bleeding after Leak had left. But surveillance footage from nearby bus stops and local businesses failed to place Leak near the house at the time of the murder. None of Brown's neighbors recalled seeing a man matching his description. No one, except Helen, could confirm that he had been there. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Fraser adjusted her narrative again. A new figure appeared. Another unnamed man, possibly a visitor from earlier in the day. She couldn't describe him, didn't know his name, but remembered he went upstairs briefly. Then he was gone. Later, she added yet another detail. She thought she heard 2 doors close, not one. Maybe someone had come downstairs during the commotion. Maybe Milton wasn't the only person involved. Each addition to the story introduced further complexity without resolving anything. This behavioral pattern is indicative of narrative manipulation, not memory failure. When facts are challenged, deceptive individuals often pivot, not to maintain truth, but to maintain control. The introduction of additional suspects serves a dual purpose. It dilutes attention from the original lie and introduces plausible deniability. In forensic behavioral analysis, this is classified as displacement, not of guilt, but of focus. Helen Fraser exhibited clear signs of cognitive compartmentalization. Her recollection of the incident was detailed in irrelevant aspects, such as what she was cooking, but vague and shifting in critical moments. This imbalance suggests emotional rehearsal rather than truthful memory. Moreover, she repeatedly invoked moral reasoning to justify her suspicions, framing Milton as someone who had taken advantage of Brown's kindness. This narrative was consistent with an underlying effort to cast the victim as naive, and herself as loyal but wronged, a tactic designed to appeal to empathy while distancing herself from direct involvement. The absence of physical evidence tying Leak to the scene, combined with Fraser's increasingly fragmented story, forced investigators to re-examine the motive. If this was not an impulsive act over money, then what had actually taken place behind closed doors? And why was the only witness producing a cascade of inconsistencies? Fraser's pattern of escalating deception followed a predictable trajectory. Each time she was pressed, the story evolved, with new elements introduced just in time to obscure the logical progression of inquiry. By the third interview, she claimed she had seen a shadow at the top of the stairs. By the fourth, she mentioned a man named Kenny. There was no record of Kenny. No calls, no visits, no trace. This was not the behavior of a frightened witness. It was the conduct of someone buying time. The psychological profile that emerged from these sessions suggested a low-capacity manipulator, not in intelligence, but in strategy. Fraser's lies were not crafted for long-term concealment. They were immediate reactions, built to deflect in the moment, without consideration for what would follow. She relied on emotional volatility to redirect attention, alternating between tears, silence, and defensiveness. This inconsistency is common in subjects experiencing stress under sustained deception. The emotional energy required to maintain multiple falsehoods creates dissonance, which often presents as unpredictable mood shifts. Leak was eventually cleared through a combination of alibi confirmation, forensic testing, and the absence of corroboration. He had been falsely accused, but the damage was done. Public perception had shifted, and time had been lost. The delay in focusing on the true suspect gave Fraser more room to maneuver and more opportunities to rebuild her story. At this point in the investigation, attention turned inward. If no one had entered the house, and if every version of the story led back to Helen Fraser, then perhaps the answer had been standing in the kitchen all along. When an individual introduces a new suspect each time their story is challenged, the behavior is rarely rooted in confusion. It is most often a form of active deception, calculated to test investigative boundaries and delay accountability. Helen Fraser demonstrated this pattern with remarkable consistency. With each interview, a new character appeared, a new version of events emerged, and the facts surrounding Andre Brown's murder became increasingly obscured by fictional fragments. Initially, there was Milton Leak. Once that claim collapsed under scrutiny, Fraser pivoted. She spoke of Kenny, a man she described vaguely, claiming he had been upstairs with Brown just before the incident. When pressed for details, her account became contradictory. She could not explain how Kenny entered or exited the home. She gave no last name, no physical description beyond generic clothing. Surveillance footage from the area confirmed no one matching that profile had been seen near the residence. The name appeared only after her previous narrative was disproven. A response, not a recollection. Later, Mark Keegan entered the story. This version was the most elaborate. Fraser described him as a dangerous figure from Chicago, involved in gang activity, who had allegedly visited the home to collect money tied to drugs. No evidence supported this claim. Investigators found no phone records, no connections between Brown and any known associates of that name. The physical description given by Fraser was inconsistent with witness statements, and most notably, Mark Keegan did not exist in any database, arrest record, or social media presence. He was a fabrication, complete with backstory, motive, and a menacing presence crafted to redirect suspicion entirely outside the household. This behavior matches a profile frequently observed in manipulative offenders, the use of false narratives not only to deny guilt, but to manufacture an alternate reality. These narratives are often layered, beginning with a partial truth, followed by exaggeration, and finally, outright invention. The layering serves two purposes. It gives the speaker the illusion of plausible deniability and overwhelms investigators with contradictions that are difficult to unravel. Fraser's delivery style also evolved. Her initial statements were linear, albeit shaky. As scrutiny intensified, her language became disjointed, marked by hesitation and revision mid-sentence. When investigators asked direct questions, she often deflected with unrelated emotional appeals, referencing past trauma, expressing fear of reprisal, or shifting attention to her own sense of victimhood. These tactics served to blur the power dynamic in the room, drawing focus away from the crime and onto her perceived suffering. In one interview, Fraser claimed she didn't see the attacker but heard a voice she recognized. In another, she said she saw a shadow moving past the stairwell. In yet another, she remembered the attacker wearing her stolen winter coat. The inconsistencies were not minor. They shifted the entire framework of the investigation. And each time she was confronted with evidence contradicting a version, she disassembled it and replaced it with another. There was no progression toward clarity, only a consistent pattern of avoidance. Psychologically, this indicates a deep discomfort with accountability, coupled with a reactive, improvisational defense strategy. Unlike calculated, pre-planned deception, which relies on rehearsed consistency, reactive deception adapts in real time. It is inherently unstable, often collapsing under pressure. Yet, its fluid nature can be confusing, particularly when the speaker introduces emotionally charged details designed to garner sympathy or cloud judgment. Investigators also noted Fraser's increasing reliance on passive language. She often referred to things just happening, or said she wasn't sure who was in the house. This linguistic distancing is a common psychological mechanism used to detach oneself from agency. It allows the speaker to remain present in the narrative while removing direct responsibility from their actions or omissions. Her polygraph examination further reinforced concerns. While polygraph results are not admissible in all jurisdictions, they can provide useful behavioral insight. Fraser's physiological responses spiked during questions about her direct involvement in Brown's death, but remained stable during general inquiries. When confronted with her results, she did not express shock or indignation, common reactions among innocent individuals falsely accused. Instead, she shifted posture, minimized eye contact, and asked whether she could change her answers. At this stage, investigators were no longer assessing whether Fraser was lying, but why she felt compelled to create such a complex web. The lies were not merely to conceal an act. They were an attempt to reshape the narrative entirely, to reposition herself as the misunderstood witness, surrounded by dangerous men, rather than the sole occupant of the house at the time of death. This behavioral pivot signaled something crucial. Fraser was not operating from fear alone. Her deception was rooted in a need to control. By constructing layers of falsehoods, she maintained dominance over the narrative. In doing so, she resisted the loss of power that would come with a confession. To someone already marginalized, exposed, and dependent, control over the story may have felt like the last form of agency she possessed. But in the pursuit of control, she created a narrative too fragile to sustain itself. Each new suspect she conjured added another fault line. Eventually, the entire structure would collapse, not under the weight of accusation, but under the impossibility of maintaining a fiction that could no longer withstand forensic reality. Still, one question remained unanswered. If Fraser was lying to protect herself, what exactly had she done? And why had she waited so long to say anything at all? But the collapse began quietly, not with a confession, but with a pause. When investigators informed Helen Fraser that Mark Keegan did not exist, that no record, surveillance, or trace of him could be found, she did not express disbelief or concern. She became still. Her posture shifted. Her voice dropped. It was not the reaction of someone whose story had been misunderstood. It was the silent recognition of a narrative unraveling faster than she could rewrite it. What followed was not a full admission, but a psychological breakdown in control. She began offering fragmented alternatives. Perhaps she had confused names. Perhaps someone else was in the house, but she had forgotten. Her speech turned evasive, built from hypotheticals rather than statements. She began referencing things she might have heard or thought she saw, despite having given confident declarations in earlier statements. The change in tone was not due to new recollections. It was the onset of cognitive dissociation. Dissociation in this context does not indicate a medical condition, but rather a behavioral defense mechanism. Faced with the weight of consequences, individuals with unstable psychological profiles often attempt to distance themselves from reality through disconnection, emotionally, linguistically, and narratively. The person present in the room no longer matches the one described in the story. The suspect fragments herself into multiple roles: the passive witness, the grieving partner, the confused bystander. The more the truth intrudes, the more elaborate the emotional detachment becomes. At this stage, investigators shifted strategies. Rather than challenge her with facts, they introduced silence. When confronted with gaps in her account, Fraser did not ask for clarification. She filled the silence with more names, more shadows, more maybes. The interviews became cycles: a question, a pause, and a new version. Each version placed her further from the knife, further from the blood, further from Brown. But the forensic evidence did not shift with her narrative. The blood pattern analysis confirmed that the victim had been standing upright, facing the source of the wound. The wound trajectory indicated a downward angle, consistent with a standing attacker facing a seated or stooped target. The knife had entered cleanly between the ribs, puncturing the aorta and right lung. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. Brown had not expected the attack, nor had he tried to resist. A single kitchen knife, missing from a block in the sink area, was never recovered. But a different knife, not used in the attack, was found in the pocket of Brown's jacket. That discovery further complicated Fraser's claim of self-defense. If the victim had been armed, it would likely have been drawn. Instead, the presence of the unused knife suggested that Brown had been cautious, but not confrontational. He had not raised it. He had not even reached for it. In psychological terms, Fraser's behavior was increasingly defined by projection and denial. She projected danger onto others, inserted fictional aggressors into the scene, and denied memory of critical actions. She had moved from constructing a lie to inhabiting it, not as an act of deception, but as a retreat from accountability. When a person cannot reconcile their actions with their identity, they may fragment their experience into separate selves, each insulated from the others by emotional distance. This behavioral splitting is not rare in high-stakes domestic homicide cases, particularly those involving dependent relationships and sudden loss of control. Fraser's dependence on Brown had been financial, emotional, and situational. Her presence in the home was rooted in his generosity. His growing frustration, expressed to family in the days leading up to his death, signaled an imminent rupture in that arrangement. For someone already experiencing feelings of rejection or abandonment, the threat of being expelled can trigger a profound psychological crisis. In some cases, that crisis manifests as violence not born from hatred, but from panic. A loss of perceived identity, coupled with desperation to maintain stability, can produce lethal behavior under acute stress. Still, Fraser did not describe the killing as an act of passion. Her statements, even in their final form, did not invoke rage, but helplessness. She said things got out of hand. She said Brown wouldn't listen. She implied she acted in response to confusion, not anger. This linguistic minimization is often a signal that the perpetrator views their action as reactive rather than aggressive. However, the physical evidence contradicted this narrative. The nature of the wound, the lack of struggle, and the precision of the strike indicated control, not chaos. In forensic interviews, Fraser continued to deny direct involvement, even when confronted with inconsistencies impossible to reconcile. Her behavioral indicators, lack of eye contact, shifting posture, monotone responses, were consistent with suppression, not remorse. There was no grief evident, only fatigue. The fatigue of maintaining multiple identities under pressure, the fatigue of storytelling without resolution. Eventually, she conceded that no one else had been in the house, that she had not seen Mark, Kenny, or anyone else that day, but she did not confess. She reframed her involvement as misunderstanding, reframed her silence as fear. This is a common endpoint for individuals attempting to preserve psychological distance from their crime. By reducing intent, they hope to preserve identity, to remain someone who made a mistake, rather than someone capable of intentional harm. But the evidence did not support mistake. It supported premeditation in the form of timing, angle, and opportunity. The knife was taken from the kitchen. The victim was in close range. The story was altered repeatedly, and when fiction failed, there was only silence. What remained unclear was not whether Helen Fraser had committed the act, but what exactly she had told herself in the moments before the knife entered Andre Brown's chest. The courtroom was quiet as the verdict was read. No outbursts, no visible emotion from the defendant. Helen Fraser stood with her hands clasped in front of her, expression fixed, eyes unmoving. The jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence, 40 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 25. No appeals were filed in the weeks that followed. The trial was straightforward in terms of evidence. Prosecutors presented a clear forensic timeline, dismantled the fabricated characters introduced by Fraser, and played audio from her inconsistent interviews. Surveillance footage confirmed the absence of any intruder. Crime scene photographs and blood spatter analysis left little room for alternate interpretations. The defense argued diminished capacity, citing emotional instability and prior trauma, but failed to establish legal insanity or coercion. Expert witnesses described Fraser as emotionally volatile, but not mentally impaired. Her actions, they concluded, were conscious, deliberate, and driven by internal motive rather than external threat. The most significant aspect of the case was not the question of guilt, but the psychological structure behind the act. Fraser did not exhibit traditional markers of predatory violence. There was no prolonged planning, no evidence of sadism, and no intent to flee. Instead, her behavior aligned more closely with reactive aggression rooted in fear, specifically the fear of abandonment and the loss of control over a dependent relationship. Throughout the proceedings, Fraser maintained that she did not intend to harm Brown. She described the incident as a moment that spiraled, suggesting a lack of awareness or intention. Yet the wound's location, depth, and angle contradicted this claim. The attack was not spontaneous or wild. It was focused and singular. A clean, fatal strike to the chest delivered at close range. There were no defensive injuries, no signs of mutual struggle, and no damage to the surrounding environment. The scene was sterile, silent. This precision revealed more than physical intent. It revealed a psychological state of containment, a moment in which Fraser's internal panic was channeled into a single, decisive act. The fear of being discarded, displaced, or exposed may not justify violence, but it often explains the transition from passive dependence to lethal confrontation. Individuals in unstable domestic dynamics sometimes perceive separation not as a loss of relationship, but as a loss of identity. When a person's sense of self is entirely tied to another's presence, the threat of rejection becomes existential. Fraser's post-crime behavior reinforced this interpretation. She did not run. She did not confess. Instead, she constructed an intricate series of lies, each more implausible than the last. The false suspects she created were not just fabrications. They were projections of her internal chaos, placeholders for guilt she could not assign to herself. As each version collapsed, her emotional affect flattened. She detached from consequence, retreating into narrative layers designed to keep her from confronting the core truth, that she had acted alone. Her psychological profile did not indicate long-term psychopathy or antisocial disorder. There was no evidence of a pattern of violent behavior, no manipulative relationships beyond the victim, and no criminal history. What emerged instead was a personality structure defined by dependency, low frustration tolerance, and impaired emotional regulation. In such profiles, when a stabilizing figure threatens to withdraw, emotionally, financially, or physically, the dependent individual may experience what clinicians refer to as catastrophic loss. In this case, that loss was not tolerated. It was neutralized. The sentencing phase brought no visible remorse. Fraser declined to make a final statement. Her silence was not defiance but exhaustion. The weight of narrative collapse, public scrutiny, and the permanence of consequence had finally stripped away all fictional distance. What remained was a single, immutable fact. The man who had offered her a home, stability, and companionship was dead, and she had taken his life. This case stands as a stark example of how fear, when left unchecked, can evolve into something far more dangerous. Not the fear of physical harm, but the fear of being left behind. The fear of irrelevance. The fear of becoming invisible in a life that once offered shelter. For some individuals, that fear becomes unbearable. It demands action. And when action is taken without emotional boundaries or cognitive control, it becomes violence. Helen Fraser's crime was not born from hatred. It was born from desperation, from the silent, internal collapse of a person whose entire world had narrowed to the approval, presence, and support of one man. When that foundation threatened to disappear, her reality fractured. And in trying to preserve it, she destroyed the very person it depended on. There is no closure in this case, no clear moral lesson, only a reminder that not all acts of violence emerge from rage or intent. Some emerge from the quiet terror of losing control, and from the belief, however distorted, that it is better to end something permanently than to face its loss.